Our first key speaker today is Kevin Bodnaruk. I hope I get this right, Kevin. I know I did, but I'm sorry. Kevin currently works in the pesticide regulations and risk assessment. He has, for more than 35 years, experience in the areas of pesticide development, use and regulations, having worked in both government and private enterprise. Kevin currently works as a consulting, providing technical input and support to Australian agriculture and horticultural industries. Kevin is an expert on maximum residual levels, MRLs, and will discuss the impact of the spray programs on the markets. So please welcome Kevin.
Thanks. Okay, what I'd like to do is, I suppose, take you through, it's a fairly dry topic in a lot of ways, but take you through the issues to do with pesticide regulation and assessment and their impacts that they're having on, if you like, chemical access in the long term, and also just purely from the point of view, and then how that flows onto trade. So it'll be fairly brief, but I'll just... Right. The three areas I want to cover is areas to do with, just like I said, I'm talking about. The regulatory pressures, they're increasing, the changing ag chem industry, and then a little bit about challenges and this type of thing. So I'll just go through those fairly briefly and just give you, I suppose, a snapshot, some context around why these things are happening. First off, you're probably all familiar with these sorts of headlines that we're seeing about things that are happening in Europe, here, New Zealand, US, you name it, compounds going off market, this type of thing being pulled because of concerns that have been flagged or issues that have come up. And so these compounds, they're disappearing. They've been used for 20, 30, 40 years in some cases, but they're going off market. And there's a number of reasons why. Why is this happening? Well, the first area is from a regulatory point of view, there's an increased sensitivity towards a whole lot of issues to do with risk. If you like, the risk appetite of regulators has diminished. So there's if you like, their appetite for the levels of risk that they're prepared to allow is a lot less than probably was 20 or 30 years ago. We've got new risk assessment methodologies that are coming in. People look at dietary exposure. We've got all the lifetime exposures that they look at. They look at exposures over 24 hours, which is the acute dietary exposure. And now we're looking at other areas where they're looking at things that are shorter than a lifetime, but longer than 24 hours. So there's a whole lot of areas that are coming in that are looking at this more closely. They're looking at cumulative aspects, and that's sort of covering where you've got compounds of similar modes of action. So previously they would look at one compound. Okay, what does that do? What's the exposure levels? This type of thing. And now they're looking at say the triazole fungicides. There's discussions now about, well, can we look at that whole group? What are the levels of exposure? Are there common metabolites that potentially impact, from a health point of view or an environmental point of view? Antimicrobial resistance is another one, where they're looking at fungicides and this type of thing in terms of whether they might affect the human gut biome. Could these things actually be causing fungicide or fungal resistance or antimicrobial resistance within the human body? So they're screening those sorts of things now. So they're looking at these types of areas. And all of these new risk assessment methodologies require the generation of data, and that's fairly expensive. We've got the Europeans have come up with the concept of qualified presumption of safety, and that's a fairly novel idea, and that's how they're dealing with biologicals. So you might think, well, biologicals, that's their natural, they're the way to go. Well, the Europeans are now looking at these things and looking at it from the point of view of saying, well, okay, but what's that actual biological doing? And so they're coming up with this idea of presumed level of safety. You've all heard of the BTs, the insecticide, the self-assuring genesis. That's going through a review at the moment within Europe. And there's questions being asked about whether these things potentially affect human health or not. The companies that produce them argue not, but there have been some papers come out where they've indicated that they believe that it could actually, in some cases, cause problems. So the Europeans are now talking about setting limits on the level of BT that could be in fresh produce. And that's spilling over into other products as well, type of thing. So you've got this whole area is sort of burgeoning. And then from a toxicology point of view, they're looking at threshold of toxicological concern. So again, we're getting more and more of these sorts of thresholds are being established, where if a compound breaches that threshold, for whatever reason, it potentially fails, which is that's basically what happens in Europe. And of course, again, all of this means more data. I mentioned the hazard-based thresholds. In Europe, it doesn't matter whether there's a risk management plan in place. A compound could be 1% in a granule, and the only way you're going to probably die from it is if you're hit by the truck that's carrying it. Irrelevant. If it fails the threshold, the tox threshold, it's gone. Full stop. It doesn't really matter what the risk assessment or the risk management plans you might have or how the risk might be managed. If it fails the threshold, it's gone. And it's as simple as that. And then we've got this concept the Europeans have brought in, the candidates for substitution. And this is where there's, if you like, a sort of a question mark over a compound, but there's nothing specific that they're concerned about. So they've termed it a candidate for substitution. So that compound, the intent is that it has to at some point go unless you can't find a replacement. If a replacement can't be found, then it will stay on the European market. But if you can find a replacement, it'll go eventually. The companies, the chemical companies are arguing against it, so they're saying, well, if it passes the risk assessment, why should it be treated any different from any other compound? But nevertheless, that's the way the Europeans are going. And the bottom line of all this, that's the wrong button, is increased data requirements. And this becomes important when we get into the area of risk where the companies, the regulators going back and then looking at compounds that have been on the market previously. And this comes as the chemical reconsiderations or re-evaluations. They're being done in Australia, they're being done overseas. You've got the APVMA, they've done Codex, Canada, US EPA, EU. They're all done. Some countries it's cyclic. In the EU, it's every 7 to 15 years, depending upon where the compound sits. If it's a candidate for substitution, it's looked at again in 7 years. If it's okay, it's 15. Canada, Codex, USA, ostensibly 15 years. So every 15 years, the compounds are going to go back through an assessment. And then when you've got all these new risk assessment methodologies being introduced, with new data requirements, and more information required, you've got a compound that's been on the market for, say, 15 years, generic. We'll register its bother to go out and generate that sort of data. And that's one of the things that we're seeing increasingly is that's not occurring. It's not that there's a problem with the product, it's just there's a data gap. And when there are significant data gaps, that eventually means the compound disappears. From an Australian point of view, we sit down in here where basically the APVMA really only looks at compounds if there's some issue that's been flagged as being a problem. In the last, I think, round of proposed regulatory changes, I think the department did talk about bringing in cyclic. But there was, I think they got shouted down by everybody else by saying that it's crazy to introduce something like that here. Just to give you an idea of where this is all going from an international perspective, these are the compounds that are either gone or going in Europe. You've got alpha sulfamethrin has been reduced, chlorothalonil is gone, chlorothalonil is gone, dimethoate's gone, the diphosphate Thiram, propanib, magnesium have been deregistered. Methram and Xyram are currently under review. You've got phenoxycarb, indoxacarb, perchloraz, propiconazole, clometrazine, thiocloprid are gone. Abamectin and bifenazate have been approved, but in permanent glass houses only. So you're getting these things, and this is for a number of reasons. I think these two, the concerns are environmental type problems. Canada bifenazine has been phased out. I think it disappeared end of last year. Methram, only one use was retained in Canada. One use, and that's for foliar use in potatoes. Thiram, all foliar uses are cancelled. Xyram, all uses are cancelled. Magnesium uses were severely restricted. One of the issues is, like from a point of view of grapes, the use was retained in grapes in Canada. One application with a 70-day withholding period. That's it. And so you can sort of see how this is flowing on. Chlorothalonil, the most recent one, they've proposed cancelling all uses of chlorothalonil in Canada. So you've got this sort of thing happening. Part of the problem again is, I think, data gaps. Chlorpyrifos has been cancelled in the US. Iprodione's under pressure. Thiram, well, I think they're proposing cancelling all Xyram. Thiram also is under pressure in the US. So you've got a lot of this sort of thing happening where compounds are coming under pressure. And even though I think for these there is a dithiocarbonate task force who are trying to defend these compounds, the difficulty is that there's significant data requirements. You've got a whole raft of different companies. And in a lot of cases, the original, if you like, the legacy manufacturer is stepping away. I mean, chlorpyrifos, I think about 2 or 3 years ago, Corteva, or was Dow, basically said that they'd stop manufacturing. They were no longer doing anything for it. So you might have a whole host of companies who might manufacture it, but they've got no access to data. And they're probably not going to be in a position to actually start funding the data generation that might be needed to actually meet the requirements. In terms of going forward, you've got reviews of planning for the diethylcarbonated codex, iprodione and chlorpyrifos. This one will probably end up potentially being a bit of a non-event because I suspect by the time they get around to doing it, there probably won't be that many uses left in many countries. But the diethylcarbonate one is going to be fairly significant because obviously the codex MRLs is what WTO refers to from the point of view of trade. India has proposed banning captan, chlorpyrifos, dexamethasone, mancozeb. Malaysia, chlorpyrifos phase out. Methanol residues are banned. Taiwan's chlorpyrifos phase out. Admittedly, they're slow. I think Taiwan, they're talking about finishing by 2026. But nevertheless, it's basically there. In Thailand, chlorpyrifos paraquat are gone. So you've got, it's a continual sort of phasing or moving of compounds, or the old compounds in particular. From an Australian perspective, because of the shift to armidol and COVID, Australia's been a bit slow, I think, in getting off the mark more recently, but we're seeing that, from talking to the APVMA, chlorpyrifos they're talking about by the 4th quarter of this year. They're looking to get diazinon, dicot, phenytophine, fipronil, malathion, paraquat, placibidone done in the next 12 or so months, and then the neonicotinoids probably sometime next year. This is basically the period of text. Then they've got a large list of compounds that have been nominated for review. And amongst those, we've got the diethylcarbonates, chlorothalonil, phenbutatin, methanol, propagite, simazine, and the triazoles. So you've got a fairly significant group of compounds there that are going to be nominated for review. But they will go back and revisit this, but the issue is going to be, again, who's going to defend these compounds potentially. And I know BASF said that they're going to try and defend Metaran, but whether the other companies are in a position to do anything about Thyran and mancozeb, I don't know. But that'll be the sort of thing that time will tell. The other issue, allied with this, is the changing face of the ag-chem industry. The number of new compounds, or at least modes of actions, or new modes of actions are declining. We've got, in some cases, quite a few compounds registered. For example, I think the Group 7, or what they call the SDHI fungicides, there's about 14 of them, I think, registered in Australia. They're all safe in the one group, but it's a relatively new group of fungicides. But the issue comes back to this sort of thing here. In 95, the global market, which is about 60-odd billion, I think, US, 20% were generics. In 2016, it's about 80% was generics. So you've got the bulk of the ag-chem industry now is generic compounds. And the issue that comes back to, with all the new data requirements coming through, and this topic, who's going to generate the new data? Where's that going to come from? We're seeing fewer R&D companies, and then you've got the market size considerations, where companies, they do have a new compound, they're going to target the markets where they're going to get the biggest bang for their buck. That's why we'll see, say, new broad-acre herbicides coming in for cereals and this type of thing, or in horticulture. It might well be, perhaps, might be one of the crops that they'll look at. But it's going to be based on where they can see a market, that they're going to get a decent market return. Just to give you an idea of this is the new, like the rate of new insecticides from 1940s to now. And you can see the trend line is fairly blunt. We get the occasional new one coming through, and these compounds, this is the isoxazolines, they're just getting registered now in Australia. I think BASF have got a compound broflanilide that they're starting to register, I can't remember the trade name, and Syngenta have got one coming through called isocyclocerin, which is a new one. So that's a new mode of action, group 30 insecticide coming through. Here we've got the diamides, that's chlorantraniliprole, cyantraniloprole, those compounds there. But they're few and far between. So this is a common trend with a lot of these. So there's fewer new compounds coming through, fewer new modes of action coming through. This is another one, you can't quite see the line there, but this is from 1960, a number of American and European chemical companies to now. You've got BASF, Bayer, Corteva, FMC, Syngenta Group, and UPL. The Syngenta Group, that consists of Adama and Syngenta. So these are the large, there's a whole lot of other smaller R&D companies in China and Japan and this type of thing. But it gives you an idea of what's happening from the point of view of where's the new compounds coming from. So there are fewer R&D companies, we're getting fewer, if you like, modes of action. So if you like, the pipeline isn't exactly bursting. So in summary, we're seeing significant increases in regulatory pressure in terms of the requirements, the risk assessments that are undertaken, the data that needs to be generated, and the questions, if you like, the questions that are being asked about compounds. The rates of technical discovery is slow. The challenge is facing it is going to be satisfying those regulatory requirements. It's going to be the availability of data. I mean, going back a few years, it might be, say, residues might have been an issue, and so you could fund maybe half a dozen residue trials or something like that, and that could satisfy the question. Unfortunately, now the questions that are being asked are becoming a lot more complex. It's not just a matter of, well, what's the residue going to be? Particularly from a European perspective, they're now looking at what are the metabolites. What are these metabolites doing? And we're seeing that's becoming a bigger issue too from the point of view of just compounds. I mean, I think fipronil is a compound, it's probably not that widely used in grapes, but it has been used in the past in a number of crops. The BASF is telling me that they're exiting all foliar uses of that compound. So by the end of this year, I think there'll be no more foliar uses on their labels. They're just going to focus on termite treatments and soil treatments and this type of thing. And that's all because of this whole question about what happens about metabolites in the plants and dietary exposure. So they're looking at use patterns where there's going to be little residues. We're trying to determine use patterns with little residues to try and address those sorts of questions so they can keep these compounds on the market. And then obviously from a trade point of view, MRL compliance. And this all flows into the whole complications when it comes to this. I won't go into too much detail there, but we get these, the whole lot of the regulation of pesticides works around what they call residue definitions. And unfortunately, historically, you could have just had one residue definition for a compound. Now it's merging down, you can have 3 or 4. You can have one for compliance, and that's just purely from the trade. As it's coming through across the border, they can test to see what the levels are. And then from the dietary exposure, it can be for women of childbearing age, it can be for the general population, it could be for plant products, or it could be for animal commodities, because they could be different in this type of thing. So these, again, it comes back to the same data that's required for these compounds that the regulators are requiring is significantly increasing, and that's obviously a cost factor. And that's when it comes to the chemical review side of things, that's where we have issues, I think, potentially are going to be running into issues about keeping these compounds on the markets. So going forward, I think it becomes important for industries to start really doing, if you like, strategic analysis, looking at what's available, what's approved for use, and I suppose what's the longevity, the likely longevity. Or, are there some skeletons in the cupboard potentially, or are there going to be some problems down the track for a particular compound? And to be aware of those sorts of things so you can actually start thinking about, are there potential replacements? If there are potential replacements, how can they be sourced? What needs to be done to try and actually develop those things into the markets? And that really comes back to prioritising the R&D. Things like the SARPs, the Board Innovation Undertake, to identify what are the key pests, the problems, this sort of stuff. And then look at what's actually approved. I did something like this sort of process with GRDC a number of years ago, where for a number of pests, you sit there and go, well, there's a whole host of insecticides registered for aphids. But when you actually looked at it, there were carbamates and organophosphates. Well, aside from resistance, there were significant issues in terms of from a trade point of view. And so it became very clear, then when we got Russian wheat aphid into the country, it became very clear they were well and truly undermanned in terms of the options that we had to try and control those aphids. It's that type of a process that needs to be undertaken. And then looking at the regulatory risks, and then part of the project that I do with Board Innovation is to, if you like, a bit of a see how the wind's blowing type of approach, and just assessing, trying to get a thumbnail's idea of the regulatory risks associated with the different compounds. So we've just gone through and looked at everything that's approved for use in grapes, or that's relevant to dried grapes, and then given a snapshot. What's happening? Where are things going? Is there a problem? And then just give it a very rough colour code. And obviously there's chlorpyrifos, it's bright red, Codex schedule review, gone from Canada, gone from Europe, gone from USEPA, and I could have listed more countries down there if I wanted to. Then there are other compounds where we've got uses that, well, because there's not that many on that page. Well, pyrethrin at the moment seem okay. It's about sort of all that's on that page. And then if you go into this thing here again, you can sort of see the potential threats that the compounds are under. You know, the chlorantraniliprol is okay. So ivermectin, that's a candidate for substitution. You know, the spinosins are okay at the moment, but effervescents for fall armament. But in terms of other pests, you know, methamol's nominated for review. The majority of uses are removed and has gone from Canada, from EU, sorry. So you've got this sort of thing where I suppose industry needs to then take stock of these sorts of situations and then start looking at where do we get our pest management products into something over the next 5 to 10 years. And with that, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.